at the household level, then we also have to think of the consumption. So this is a global problem with dire consequences, and the worst people who are affected are children, mainly because they are growing, their nutritional requirements cannot wait, and they are also developing. Definitely a global problem, but we have higher prevalences in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, chronic malnutrition is, that is just the data, the very high level of global malnutrition. But amongst children, we also find that apart from going hungry, quite a good percentage of them are also stunted. And it has always been recorded, and I think this still stands, that about 50% of all deaths in children under 5 are there's an underlying malnutrition. So prevalence of food insecurity is predicted that in this year it will reach about 17 million. So as I said, Africa and Sub-Saharan is affected, is more affected. So just looking at the track towards the SDGs, we see that Africa is nowhere near being on track. In fact, if anything, may be going in the opposite direction. So we see that in Africa, about 277 million and 399 million have either severe and moderate food insecurity, respectively. And in the past decade, the numbers of malnourished in Africa rose from 5.5 million to 30 million. Again, in 2012, very high levels of infant and child underweight and even mortality recorded in Africa, the highest in the world. And again, the prevalences, if you look at the trend, the prevalences are just on the increase. So this is just to show the World Hunger Map. And as you can see, Africa is just more of red, and the chocolates, it's like there are no green forests that we know that exist in Africa. So this slide adapted from that reference shows us the determinants and consequences of food insecurity, just to show that what I had introduced, the availability, accessibility, and utilization. And sadly, you may find that in one household, all these things are actually affected or are playing up. Again, this is just to emphasize the same. And I think I'll just go to the next slide that just shows us the list of some of these that affect children. So the consequences of food of growth, mental development, and malnutrition. For sub-Saharan Africa, more of stunting, but countries there's also quite a bit of overweight and obesity. And then micronutrient deficiency can really be a silent nutrition. The third aspect is mainly behavioral and emotional problems. And for children who are school going, then they are also affected by the issue of poor performance or absenteeism. And then lastly, we see a whole array of lowered immunity and other medical conditions. So a child, of course, who is affected in early infancy or early childhood would end up being a standard child, who would end up being a malnourished girl, and all that then affects the whole cycle of their life. So food, I'll talk a bit about the measurements of food insecurity, and also a bit about the challenges of applying this to children. So in general, the tools which are used are available, but they tend to lack consistency in what is being measured. And then there's also the whole aspect of cultural differences and inhibitions that play up. Again, applying some of these reports depending on national balances or even the level of malnutrition, have got limitations because, as you know, reports are always have weaknesses of memory, and malnutrition is in itself a consequence of food insecurity. It's like putting the egg before the chicken. Um, so this slide just gives a summary of the 4 tools that are currently available. I don't have to go through each one of them, but as you can see, most of them are mainly applicable for or have been derived from the developed countries. Those are the main ones that have been being used. And the information gathered during this monitoring mainly focuses in economic status and particularly experiences of adults, which are in those households. But we find that for children, because they have multidimensional experiences of food insecurity, there is need for being more careful in teasing how they are being affected, and not just depending on the experiences or the reports from the adults. So just to mention some of the gaps as we apply them to the pediatric age group, is that they really lack validity in the being addressing how children are affected. And often when their samples are being taken, they may not be really representative of children's experiences. And the kids also have their own perspective, but you find that the adults would want to represent the children's perspective, which may not be the truth. So there is really a need for coming away from that and diving deeper to really understand how children are affected. Um, so just to summarize this again, is that existing household survey tools underrepresent the children at greatest risk of being food insecure. And they also underreport children's food insecurity, even for those who are sampled, even in those households. Because you see, for children who are at greater risk, that those who are in institutional setting, the homeless children, they are not in those households, and yet the households really. So we find that there's definitely a gap in representing such a constituency. So this slide just summarizes how we should really be thinking in the best approaches if we want to represent children's food insecurity. There should be an effort to derive the children's own experience and to interpret them in a way that can be cross-cultural, and even in various different situations, cultures, and the like. And again, we want to emphasize on areas where we can allow for cross-sectional comparisons as well as prospective tracking within over time for children, even as they grow. So a combination of several of these factors would be the best, where we have parental reports, but also have children's report, and also look at the household condition as well as the child's condition. So of the 4 tools that I had shown before, the one that seems to be closely applicable to children would be this one called the Food Insecurity Experience Scale for the Voices of the Hungry project as implemented with the Gallup World Poll. So in this tool, I'll just try to summarize it here. You see that there is this the spectrum of where you start with mild food insecurity to severe food insecurity, where at this lower level, the child or the individuals are just worried that they may not access the food. Then later on, we start seeing the quality being compromised, then the quantity being compromised, and eventually even the experiences of real hunger and actually going without food, and the trauma of going without food. Uh, so some of the proposed interventions at various levels, it's good to note that from the WHO, they predict that investments in nutrition interventions can actually save up to 3.7 million people by 2025. So these interventions, if they can be offered at global, national, individual, household, and individuals, would be a great investment. But we see that most of it is actually the burden for changing this tide rests amongst the national level. So this other side, the blue section, actually just gives a summary of some of the measures that countries can put in place in order to invest in nutritional interventions so that the food insecurity can be dealt with. And so some of them definitely would also affect the children, but basically it cuts across the board. And we see that children, as I had said, would be the greatest beneficiaries of some of these investments, which range from a global level, trying to deal with economic resilience, to supporting agriculture, to giving even food feeding programs, but also in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, cash transfers have also been found to be useful in some situations, but not in the long term. So this summarizes just how some of those interventions can be put in place. So I think maybe at that level, I can just I could turn it over to Jason, and then we can come back to the discussions, but maybe I can get a proposal from the floor.
I think what we could do, Falgona, is we could start with your discussion, and then we can turn it to Jason, and he'll give a little bit of a talk and start his discussion. Jason, does that sound okay to you?
Yep, I think that sounds great.
Perfect. And before we go into discussion, actually, I did want to, first of all, see if you all have questions. And then
questions. First, we can start with questions, and then we can pick some of these. We don't have to deal with all of them, but we could pick some of these and discuss them.
So the only thing I was going to ask you, or maybe add, is, the main surveys that are used often in sub-Saharan Africa, as Falgona mentioned, don't have those child-centered questions. There is this, the Household Food Security Survey module, which is from the US Department of Agriculture, does have this separate section on child referenced questions where you ask, like, I have it up here, like, we relied on only a few kinds of low cost food to feed my children. I couldn't feed my child a balanced meal, or we couldn't feed my child a balanced meal because we couldn't afford that. My child was not eating enough because I just couldn't afford enough food, etc. And so there is this questionnaire with these child-focused questions, and I was just going to state that's what is very interesting when we're administering those in the US, because this is validated mainly for the US, is that we find that people are very comfortable answering all the questions, and then it gets to the child-focused questions, and they are very ashamed and very embarrassed. And it is very hard for people to answer these questions because people have a much easier time talking about their own food insecurity than about their child's food insecurity. So then there's also this accuracy question about getting correct information. And we had to work very hard on training our interviewers to be very sensitive when asking these questions and enable people not to feel ashamed, to enable them to, to be able to be upfront about what is going on with their child's food situation. And Falgona, I don't know if you have any experience with that, with stigma in the families talking about people's food insecurity.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I think it may even be worse this side because, as I mentioned, that adults, okay, we talk about their own experiences, but I think when it comes to now talking about the child, they actually don't represent the child's need because they do not want to feel embarrassed to say that the child did not eat or the child missed food. So it would be like covering the situation. So I think it may even be worse. The cultural inclination this side would even be worse for children. But I think other people can also just chip in. I can see a hand up. Maybe, is that Anka? Maybe you can shout.
Yeah, I have one quick question. One of the articles that we read talked specifically about the gender differences among girl children and boy children in food insecurity. And I wonder if that's, if you're already having difficulties in the measurements that you did find to distinguish the child food insecurity specifically, is there anything about gender differences in those measurements that you came across, or is that also a big gap?
That's still a big gap. Actually, there's a big gap, particularly for the cultural situation in sub-Saharan Africa. And even in what is already there, there's really no direct, anything that focuses the gender-related issues. But I guess just from what I can think of from the top of my head or experience, that the boy child compared to the girl child would definitely be better, in terms of access of food or being preferred in terms of feeding compared to the girl child. So I don't know if there's someone managing for us the platform to see hands, if there are any hands raised, or are people just to shout? Rachel, can you see hands being raised?
Yeah, it looks like Kenneth has a comment or question. Kenneth, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So thank you, Dr. Falgona, for the insightful presentation. From your presentation, it's like we are in a dilemma on how we can measure child food insecurity. There's an article I was reading says that we can use prevalence of undernourishment. What would be your opinion on the same? Thank you.
Sorry, you were breaking a bit, so you can come up again, the last sentence.
I'm saying thank you for the insightful presentation. From your presentation, it's like we are in a dilemma on how we can measure food insecurity among us children. So there's an article I came and stunting as a measure of food insecurity in children. So what's your opinion on the same? Is this an adequate tool, the use of prevalence of undernourishment among us children? Thank you.
Yeah, no. Okay, as I mentioned, of course, even in these other global measures, they tend to bring in the aspect of malnutrition and as a proxy measure of food insecurity. And yet we see that actually food insecurity leads to malnutrition. So it's like, putting the egg before the chicken, it's the reverse of what you really want. So in a way, it will be underrepresentative of what you really want to look for. If you look at the other statistics that I showed, that you can be food insecure, but not manifest the global macro malnutrition, but you could have micronutrient deficiencies, and later on, then you have a section of those who are food insecure, then manifest the obvious gross, severe malnutrition. Like if once you are stunted, that is really a severe form of malnutrition. So it can be used, but as you can see, it will be underestimating what the main problem is.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, my name is Colin, one of the students. So my question is, within the determinants, did you have an opportunity maybe to look at the impact of climate change, especially on food security?
Yeah,
children?
definitely. I think in the determinants, yeah, definitely that is one of the major things. Climate change, environmental factors are major determinants of food insecurity at a global level. So I think it was in one of the slides that I rushed through, but yeah, you are right.
Then follow up to that on the means and measuring for household food security. For displaced populations, you find they rely a lot on food aid assistance, which comes in form of both food and sometimes the cash transfers you've talked about. In assessing the food gap analysis, because it's very difficult to really compute, like when you're giving cash-based interventions on whether families are able to turn that completely into food to meet the nutrient needs. How can we go about such issues during assessment?
Yeah, I think maybe that we can open it up to discussions, like, because the how to actually measure, because already we are beginning with a population that is not readily accessible. They are not in the normal households, and you are giving them cash transfers, and you are not even able to determine whether they use it. And when they use it, the other thing that plays out for children is that once the food is brought into the household, how much actually goes to the child. You have to begin with, in our African setting, the person who must eat a full meal is well known, I think, isn't it? Asach, you will tell me, who is it? Who must eat a full meal in a household, in an African household?
They say the father, but we don't agree.
The father.
Oh.
Outside.
So the father must, okay. So then, so what I'm saying, the food rationing, how do you manage the food that you actually get? So that is also another component. I just didn't have enough time to talk about it. But once you have that food, then how do you ration it? How do you manage it? How do you ensure that this child actually gets a balanced diet? Because of course, the good thing with children, their stomach is small and their are not so huge, but are you giving them what they need? Are you making sure that it's a balanced diet? Or are you just giving them something to fill their stomach so that they don't cry? So definitely how that can be measured is really a tough order. And it may call just for a separate specialized way of measuring that management, the management of the cash transfers. But that's a good thing to talk about.
And just one more thing to add for Colin is we're going to do a separate lecture in the not too distant future on climate change food insecurity, and HIV. So we'll get to some of those links with climate change.
Okay.
Should we go to your discussion questions?
Yeah, so maybe let me start with, yeah, so maybe we can start with the last one. This last one. So in your opinion, which interventions do you think should be tried further? And probably for the choice that you make, what study methods or approaches can be used? Could be used, yeah. So maybe we can, how many people do we have on the floor? This new world order where you don't even know.
12 to 14
Okay.
students.
So I can have any volunteer? Any volunteer? I think we shared them 2 days ago, so maybe you've had time to think about some potential interventions. Yes, is that Anka again? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So in the US, for food insecurity in children, school lunch programs are a very big component of that. A lot of children that experience food insecurity at home are getting free school lunches. And now with the epidemic where the schools are closed and children can't get their school lunches, that's actually a big problem. I wonder if there are any smaller projects, probably like this in Kenya as well, where has been tried to fight food insecurity in children in schools directly, maybe.
Yeah, so I think Anka brings in the issue of the school food lunches or feeding programs. And maybe we can just list some of them first, just to refresh our minds. And probably we did not have enough time to look at each one of them. But there's the feeding programs, then there's the cash transfers. Which other ones did we mention, or did you come across in your readings? The other people?
School gardens.
School gardens or even family gardens. Any other? Somebody else? Which other interventions are there which have been tried? But you can also think of anything else that can be tried. I think that is the beauty of research, so that we think outside the box.
I think we've also had
Shout your name first. Shout your name first.
This is Colin again. I think there have been interventions around the blanket feeding programs, especially for children aged 6 to 23 months.
Blanket?
Supplementary feeding program.
Yes, supplementary feeding programs, and those actually also exist even in the US. Okay, any other?
This is Dan Omolo. There have been also microclinics for fathers and caregivers of children below 2 years. This one has been tried in Mpangano Island, and a promising result. Microclinic intervention.
And just explain it a bit. You can give us a descriptive of what it means. I had micro clinics. I don't know if I got it right.
You got me right, Daktari. So this involves bringing together people who have a particular health problem and taking them through a curriculum designed for basic education. So it is a matter of, let me say, nutrition specific intervention, like the nutrition education component.
Yeah,
so
it's
the mothers,
health education, eh?
yes, so mothers and caregivers of children who are below a particular age, like 3 years, are brought together. They choose a place at a time that they are trained together. And we actually netted this one into the community health strategy, which is existing in Kenya. The community health workers or volunteers were organizing these women, mothers and caregivers, into groups. And the groups were called microclinics in Doluo Kanyakla, the Kanyakla program. And the results were promising. Within after 6 months of the intervention, we could find some changes in food access pathways. And when we measured when we took some anthropometry, we found that there was some, I mean, the head circumference changes. There were some increase in body mass and things like that. So we actually also found a reduction in the stunting rate in the intervention arm compared to control arm. So though it took a short duration, but then it was promising.
Yeah, so I think what Dan is mentioning is under health education. And so we have seen this food feeding programs, cash transfers, the garden issues, both in school and family, the food supplements, then now this whole aspect of health education. And I think one of the articles which I asked you to read showed some of the outcomes from some of these interventions, and some of them which the weaknesses and the like. So it's interesting, Dan, that you mentioned that the one of health education in Fangano Island had good results, because the article, not much was coming out from health education. So it would be good to know how this you implemented what you did, and even if you could be able to share it with the rest of the world, or even us at some point, because if you can publish it and it has measures, it has met rigor of science, it would be really interesting to know how it was delivered, and it's encouraging to hear that. So,
Yeah, I can share with the team a link. There is one publication which is already out, and I may also continue. That is where I was working on my master's program, and I can be able to share the results.
thanks a lot, Dan. Your network is a bit unstable, but we've got you. So I think we have had an example of like, I think we could think of this dance, the dance example, as an intervention that could be tried locally, and I feel like I think people should be thinking of not just single interventions, but multiple, a package of interventions, so that health education that is just limited to just the information, maybe not enough. Maybe you may want the health education and mix it up with maybe some of this gardening that, there can be some new skills and the like. So if it is the cash transfer, then the issue of even accountability and the like. So definitely, maybe single interventions may not be the way to go, but combined interventions a beautiful thing to look at. So I'm just throwing it there, but I don't know if you have enough time to go further.
I think what we'll do, Falgona, just because we're at around the halfway point, is maybe we'll turn to Jason now, but then we'll come back.
Yeah, we can come back here.
At the end.
Yeah, we can come back. I think one of the things just to take home from our discussion is the challenges in measurements that can be applied to children. And I think we then also then just need to think very hard in terms of appropriate intervals that can be pushed to the next level. Thank you. So I was just showing you my food, the food that I ate yesterday. So maybe I'll just show it to you before I come out from here. That I don't know whether you know this food, but it's very nutritious. This is omena, and this is kale, and this is ugali. So thank you.
Thank you, Filgona, for that excellent presentation, and we'll turn to Jason.
Slides up. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to join you today. As Sherry mentioned, I'm a pediatrician, but my specialty is in adolescent and young adult health. And so I'm very excited to share with you a little bit about adolescents and young adults, and I was hoping that we can also have a great discussion as well. So I think that there were some readings that were sent out, and I actually wanted to start out with a little bit of a discussion question. This is from the first reading by Susan Sawyer et al. 2018, which talks about actually what is adolescence and young adulthood. And sort of one of the main points from that article is that there aren't really great standardized definitions for these age ranges. You know, you've probably heard of adolescence or youth, but people kind of use these terms interchangeably, but some of the actual ranges can vary, you know, based on literature or on context. And so I actually just wanted to start out by asking you, you know, either based on the reading, what in general do you think are the ages that are defined like an adolescent? Feel free to.
Jason, this is Jackie, and I think that if I was agreeing more with the expanding the range that they were proposing in terms of from 10 to 24 years. And so first, because you know I am leading an organization here in Kenya, and that is the age range we use, and we chose that because of the educational pathway. So oftentimes, after 18 years old, you've just finished secondary school, you're still dependent on your family to, you know, help you get to college, and at least for our context in Kenya, for college education, there's still a lot of dependency that the young people would have on their family and their parents. And I thought, so for me, it was sort of expanding it to that range captures those who have just finished secondary school, but still need sort of the things Soya was talking about in terms of like developing their cultural, economic, and kind of social assets to become more independent. And I think also at that 24, post 24, you are also becoming more economically independent, which for me would be a better social metric for like adulthood compared to at 18. So that is just my thought from that in terms of the definition for adolescent.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. And actually, I'll just follow up with the question either for you or for anyone. In Kenya, what is the age at which you like officially become an adult, like legally?
Actually, legally become an adult at 18. So you get your national identity card, and you can be able to vote in terms of like your civic responsibilities. I think in other things, in terms of like even buying alcohol, I think for us it's just like that one standard age of 18. But from just what, life experiences. I have a nephew who is just 19 going to college now, and it's like he needs a lot of support that you wouldn't sort of say he's become as independent as somebody who would be maybe 25, 24 and over is. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I guess,
Hello?
yes, go
So
ahead,
it's
Frida.
Thank you. So it simply means that at age 18, you now become an adult, but you still depend on your parents in Kenya, because at age 18, you find many youths are still not working. Maybe they are in colleges, so they solely depend on the parents, though they have an ID and are treated as adults. In case of a criminal case or anything, they are treated as adults. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida. In Kenya, do you, either in research or just in general terms, do you use the term like young adulthood? Is that something that, an age range that is like referred to, or not really?
Jason,
Yes,
can
we
you come
do.
up again? Sorry, I didn't get that.
Oh, is young adulthood an age range that people talk about or refer to in Kenya?
Yes, this is done. We do have adolescents and young adults, ayas. We usually refer to them as ayas. And then we also have another term, AGYWs, like adolescent girls and young women. So the word young adults and young is actually used to repeat it.
Great, thank you. One other question before I move on. What age range do pediatricians see in Kenya? Like for pediatricians who take care of children, what's the oldest children that pediatricians would take care of before they go off into seeing adult doctors?
12 years.
Okay, so after,
yeah, I know. In
12.
principle, pediatrics is up to 19, but comfortably,
Hospitals.
I think around 13, yeah, 12 to 13,
12.
where the pediatricians feel comfortable that they're dealing with a pediatric case. Yeah.
Some see up to 14 years of age. This is Lucy.
Yes, I also wanted to say up to 14.
great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's just, as is noted by this article, there's quite a large range of different definitions of these different age groups. And, it does vary by country and by context. And so, in comparison to Dr. Falgona, who, is meant, or like, and what you've just said that, in general, even though pediatricians can see up to age 19, it's generally under, ages 12 or 14. It can vary quite a bit. So like in where I practice, we have sort of a medical specialty called adolescent and young adult medicine. So even though I'm a pediatrician, I actually can see patients up to even age 30. And so, yeah, there's just quite a range. And so as is referenced by the Susan Sawyer article, the official WHO definition of adolescence is about 10 to 19. So that's right here. But for all the reasons that like Jacqueline and other people were saying, they're sort of arguing that maybe the new definition of adolescence should actually extend, or this idea of adolescents and young adults should really extend further. Some people say to age 24, 25, just because there's still brain, developmental changes going on. As you mentioned, there's still, dependency maybe on, your parents for financial support or even food. And, depending on your educational trajectories, you may still also be, still in school or university. So, in general, the age range that defines young adult, the reason why these are kind of shaded is that it's not standardized, but most studies will start young adulthood around age 18. Some go up to even age 30. I've even seen some of the cardiology literature where they're talking about heart attacks and stuff like that, go all the way up to even 40 as young adults. So it does range quite a bit, but just other things to notice in general, youth kind of also is more like older adolescents. So maybe starting around age 15 to 25. People also refer to older adolescents. So, around 15 to 20, or teenagers. So like, 13 to 20. There's also young or early adolescents. So that's like 10 to 15. So anyway, I just thought this was a helpful graph to think about adolescence, because I feel like we use all these terms a lot and it's not super standardized. So that's just a brief introduction. So I thought there's actually very little research on adolescent food insecurity particularly. So I did think that I would talk a little bit about adolescent and young adulthood in general, and specifically social determinants of health in general, before we go specifically to food insecurity. So just in general, there's 1.2 billion adolescents with the WHO definition of age 10 to 19 years, make up 16% of the world's population, but a vast majority live in low and middle income countries, and actually 97% of deaths among these young people occur in low and middle income countries. This is just a summary from WHO of the top causes of adolescent mortality in boys by the early adolescents, so 10 to 14 years up on the top, and then the older adolescents on the bottom. So you can see road injury is actually quite high, especially in the older adolescents for boys and men. Also violence, self-harm, drowning, lower respiratory infections. Now, if we look at girls, especially for the younger adolescents, the top causes are lower respiratory infections, diarrhea, meningitis, HIV. But as you get into older adolescents, actually the top causes maternal mortality or more maternal conditions, then self-harm, then road injury, and then some infectious diseases like diarrhea and lower respiratory infections. I also just wanted to talk a little bit about adolescents as a proportion of the population. I thought this was kind of an interesting graph. This is from the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health. But this shows the percentage of each country's population that are adolescents or young adults. So the broader range from 10 to 24. But actually, as you can see in most of sub-Saharan Africa, 30 to 35% of the population is adolescents and young adults. So in Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa, actually adolescents have a larger proportion of the population than almost anywhere else in the world. You can see that, in the Americas, it's more like 20 to 25%, also Asia. So actually the largest proportion of, the population in sub-Saharan Africa compared to other countries are in this age range of adolescence and young adulthood. I know that there's a big focus on social determinants of health, for this course. And so this is also, I thought, a kind of interesting figure from the Lancet Commission that talks about how social determinants of health change, during adolescence and the transition to adulthood. And so it's sort of just, this is just a visual, but, in general, during adolescence, social determinants from outside of the family can start to become greater. So with major influences from like peers, the media, your educational context, and then also it's showing that, at some point in this period, many people start to enter the workforce. And so, employment and work influences start to increase as, people transition to young adulthood. But family is always, very important. And I guess another consideration is that at some point, many adolescents and young adults are starting their own families. So they may have, their own partner and children and dependents, and those start to become, more important as age transition goes along. One other interesting sort of visual that I thought was this is showing the average education participation of 15 to 24-year-olds. And this is looking at girls. And so this is just showing that, in some areas, the average participation is, 1 to 3 years or 4 to 6 years. And this sort of contrasts with in boys, there are definitely gender disparities that, there are in general fewer average years of education for girls versus boys. And there are also sort of differences, by country and by region. So, I'm very excited about adolescent and young adult health because it's actually a relatively new field. The medical specialty of adolescent medicine is actually fairly new. In the US, it's only been around for a few decades. And actually, most countries do not have like a medical subspecialty of adolescent and young adult medicine. And in fact, I don't think Australia does have one, but the UK and many parts of Europe don't. I'm not aware of any specific adolescent medicine like training programs in sub-Saharan Africa, but perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong. But traditionally, as was discussed, pediatrics really has focused on younger children, and there's been a big focus on under 5 mortality and sort of surviving this first 1,000 days. But there hasn't been as much of a focus on adolescents because the general consensus has been that adolescents are healthy, they've already survived this critical window, and they're generally doing fine. But I think that in recent years there has been more of an emphasis on adolescent health, and this is sort of reflected by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There are many goals that are related specifically to adolescents. The UN also had a name change recently. They had a global strategy on women's and children's health, and around 2015 they actually added specifically adolescents to that. So it's the global strategy on women, children's, and adolescents health, and there are specific metrics and priorities within adolescent health, which actually has changed some funding, which has allowed for more resources to look at adolescent health. There has also been, the Lancet, the medical journal has commissioned a commission on adolescent health and well-being. So some of those figures with the maps that I showed were from their work. And even the World Health Organization has, launched in the last couple of years a global accelerated action for the health of adolescents, so, implementation at the country level for promoting adolescent health. So it's a very exciting time, for adolescents, because I think, it's kind of at the very high levels, there are more focus and funding that's going towards this, and hopefully that will, begin to trickle down at the country level. Sort of reflecting that, I just wanted to share briefly that, when I was a trainee, I got to do an internship at the World Health Organization as they were, preparing for this global action for adolescent health stuff. And so I got to participate in this scoping exercise that looked at the research priority areas in adolescent health, specifically in low and middle income countries. And as reflected as sort of those mortality figures that I had shown earlier, these are some of the priority areas, sexual and reproductive health and HIV, of course, but then also other things like injuries and violence and mental health and nutrition and physical activity. So these were some of the priority areas from WHO, and just showing some of the visualizations actually from there were like hundreds of different priority questions, but we actually just did a word cloud that looked at those questions and that sort of visually shows what some of the adolescent health research priorities were. And, because it's such a new field, there's so many unanswered research questions in adolescents. And then I was mentioning earlier that the UN Global Strategy recently added adolescents specifically, and one of the paradigms in the global strategy for adolescent health has been this paradigm of survive, thrive, and transform. So as I mentioned, earlier, a lot of focus has been on surviving through the first 1,000 days. So that's the survive thing. But I think the transition to thinking about how you not only, it's not, while it's obviously important that, people survive and young people are able to live through the first 1,000 days, but, even beyond that, as we don't want you to just be alive, we want you to really thrive and, transform into, full independent adults and also like have a good quality of life. So this was just sort of reflecting that survival is important, but there are also other aspects of like quality of life and that are important even from a health understanding. So I know you've talked a lot about food insecurity in earlier today with Dr. Falgona and also with other stuff. So I won't talk about that too much in general, but just to say that there's quite limited research on food insecurity in adolescents and young adults. And as has been mentioned by Jacqueline and others, adolescence is really and young adulthood is an important period that young people may be at risk for food insecurity, either because they're going through educational transitions, they're trying to become economically independent. And so while they may initially be dependent on their parents, they may need to start, procuring or buying their own food. And also as they start parenthood or their own families, they now have dependents that they need to, be responsible for the food security of. There has been literature that you've probably read in the past or even for earlier today in the pediatrics section that have shown kind of adverse health outcomes in children and adults, but there's really not that much specifically on food insecurity in adolescents and young adults. So I actually thought that I would talk very briefly about a few studies that I've worked on with Sherry and some other colleagues looking at food insecurity in young adults in the US. And I'll go through that relatively quickly so that we can focus most of our discussion on the articles on food insecurity in Ethiopia and Tanzania. But it's just to say that we looked at the association between food insecurity in young adults and chronic diseases. So that includes diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obesity, obstructive airway disease, migraine, as well as mental health and substance use, which, as we mentioned, is suicide. Mental health issues are a big priority in adolescent and young adult health. So we looked at depression, anxiety, suicide, poor sleep, and then other substances like opioid, marijuana, methamphetamines. And then finally, we looked at sexual health. So some sexually transmitted infections, as well as some behaviors. And so we used a national sample of the US of about 20,000 teenagers who've been followed into young adulthood. This is a cohort study, so there have been 5 waves of data collection, but we used the 4th wave, which was 24 to 32 years old. So again, a little bit on the older end of young adulthood, but that was the only time period when they asked about food insecurity. So they used the first item of the US household food security scale. So in the past 12 months, was there a time when you or your household was worried about whether food would run out before you would get money to buy more? And I mentioned already, we looked at chronic disease, mental health, substance use, and sexual health outcomes. Most of those were from self-report. And then just conducted some logistic regression analyses that incorporated sample weighting so that they could be representative estimates of the whole US. And then we adjusted for potential confounders like education, income, age, sex, race, ethnicity, smoking, and alcohol. So this is just to say that these are associations with food insecurity and these health outcomes, even independent of income and education and those other factors. So the sample was about 50-50 male-female. It was racially and ethnically diverse. So if we just look at the prevalence of food insecurity in young adults, we can see there are, similar to what we had shown sort of disparities by gender before. In general, females had higher rates of food insecurity than males. It's about 14% versus 9%. And then these are just unadjusted comparisons that look at so the dark blue is people who were food insecure, and the light blue was people who were food secure. And in general, you can see that each of these health outcomes was higher, had a higher prevalence in the food insecure group. So food insecure people had higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of obesity, migraine, and depression. So that's just a little bit of a visual, but we actually look at the adjusted odds ratios that adjust for all of those confounders we were talking about, like socioeconomic status and some other behaviors. We still see that food insecurity was significantly associated with higher odds of diabetes, of hypertension, of being very overweight, and obstructive airway diseases like asthma or bronchitis or emphysema, and migraines, as well as some poor mental health outcomes like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, trouble falling asleep and trouble staying asleep, substance uses like marijuana and opioids and methamphetamines, and then also sexual health outcomes, so higher odds of chlamydia and gonorrhea and any sexually transmitted infections, as well as exchanging sex for money. So just to summarize the findings from those studies, in the US, we found that food insecurity was a significant determinant of health across several health domains, and was associated with chronic disease, mental health, substance use, and sexual health. And these findings were robust even after adjusting for income and education and other potential confounders. So indicating food insecurity is not simply a proxy for poverty. I know that one of the topics of interest for today was talking about the link between food insecurity and chronic disease. And so I just wanted to talk through a few potential mechanisms or reasons why food insecurity could lead to chronic disease like diabetes or hypertension. So in general, food insecurity may be lead to increased stressors. We also showed that in particular leads to poor mental health and substance use, and that may actually lead to like higher levels of cortisol and insulin resistance, which could increase your risk for diabetes. Depending on the context. So in the US, at least, food insecurity is associated with like poor nutrition, but not necessarily less nutrition. So people may have more kind of junk foods or calorie dense, nutrient poor foods like processed foods that may be cheaper but less nutritious. And so that could be linked to chronic disease. Also, it's have a less ability to work or generate income. And there are also sort of bi-directional links. So it could also be that the reverse. Other more specific pathways could be just the cyclic nature of food insecurity can promote insulin resistance. Alternating food availability may promote binge eating, so you overeat when you do have food, and then there are times when you don't have food. And then we had kind of talked about chronic stress leading to insulin resistance and high blood pressure and higher adiposity. This is then talking about like sort of the reverse link. We were talking about these bidirectional links. So actually having a chronic disease then can worsen your food insecurity, because if you have diabetes or hypertension, you may have to, purchase medications to manage that, which is money that you don't have to spend on food. you may have to go to more healthcare visits for monitoring and testing. And so there are more costs associated with that. And people with chronic conditions, may not be able to work as much. And so they won't have as much income. And, for some of these conditions that are somewhat nutrition related, people may have more advice or dietary counseling about like healthy nutrition. And I guess one study showed that may increase people's awareness of diet recommendations and their inability to attain these diet recommendations, which can also lead to stressors. But there are some limitations of the study. It was just cross-sectional and observational, so it was not able to determine causality. And as we mentioned, they could be sort of bidirectional links. But it was a large national sample from the US that is one of the few studies to look at food insecurity in young adulthood. I wanted to just be aware that, because there's so little literature, I just presented that data from the US that Sharon and I had worked on, but I wanted to spend the rest of our time talking about some of the studies that I was able to find in adolescents in Ethiopia and Tanzania in relation to food insecurity. So we can do those discussion questions, but maybe before we move on to these questions, we can take a little bit of a pause to see if anyone has any comments or questions about the content thus far.
So I just wanted to make a quick comment before we get people's questions. So first of all, thank you, Jason. That was excellent. I know that there has been this question about, how much of our discussion here will focus on sort of Kenya specific or sub-Saharan Africa specific findings and studies. And, we had a discussion among the faculty last week, and we think that while we will try to make, bring in the sub-Saharan African context as much as possible, because, this is also a global health class, we thought it would also be informative to continue to bring in examples from other settings, including the US. So it'll be a mix and won't always be solely sub-Saharan African focused, though we will always have content relevant to Kenya in each talk. So I just wanted to make that clarification. And then the only other thing I will add is those of you who are looking to learn how to publish papers, Jason is a good person to learn from, because even as before he had even reached faculty, he somehow had, almost 80 publications or something. So he is the master publisher and is a good person to reach out to on how to utilize your data effectively and turn it into publications. And so,
I'm going to ask a question.
Yes.
Okay. So Jason, and I'm asking this to be provocative. So I'm not expecting you to have the answer. In fact, I don't think there is an answer. But is there any research to your knowledge that looks at the impacts of structural racism in the US and its impacts on adolescents' food security and also the NCDs, infectious diseases you've mentioned? So, and then as a corollary into the Kenyan context or in neighboring African countries, is there any data looking at the post-colonial legacy and the impacts on these same factors? So I've been reading a book by, he gave grand rounds recently at UCSF in the Institute for Global Health Sciences, Gene Richardson, and he's written a very provocative book, which I'm in the middle of reading, which basically posits that the global health structures we've had are a result of the colonial past and present. And in fact, they continue to propagate poor health and other outcomes in Africa and other regions of the world. So what are your thoughts on it? Because you're looking at social determinants of health, but I'm wondering if we were to even go further upstream, do you think there's an association with structural racism in the US and by extension, perhaps, the colonial legacy in Africa?
Thank you for that question, Craig. And first, I also want to acknowledge that Craig and Sherry have been, as Sherry mentioned, have been my advisors for over a decade. So I've been very fortunate to have learned most of this stuff from them. But the first question about, structural racism obviously is a really big priority right now in the US. We're addressing and understanding structural racism. And so actually one of the newest cohorts, so the ad health cohort that we analyzed here started in the 90s. So these people actually now are in their 40s. So, all the exposures from adolescents are now 25 years old. So it's a little bit hard to, so that while it's great that it's a cohort study, the context, from the 90s of adolescence is different than it is now. But the NIH has actually funded a new cohort called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is also a national multi-site study that just started data collection in 2016. It started with 9-year-olds, and it's actually doing yearly data collection for following these 9-year-olds until they're age 20. And so I've started actually analyzing data from that. And they recently have started to ask questions about perceived racism. I think it's called the perceived racism scale. And we actually just looked at the experiences of racism by 10-year-olds, 10 and 11-year-olds, and basically found that in general, I think overall, something like 6 or 7% of 10 or 11-year-olds report that they've experienced racism or discrimination based on their ethnicity. And this was highest in Black or African-American youth, or I guess 10 to 11-year-olds. I have to be careful with my language because they're not. In terms of, so that's just descriptive. I think we can start to look at health associations. It does this racism, is racism in itself associated with some of these poor health outcomes? I haven't started doing that yet. I will say that I have actually looked at discrimination from the ad health cohort, but it's now, as I mentioned, they're more young adults or even just adults because they're in their 30s and 40s, but experiencing racism in your 30s and 40s is associated with the cardiovascular disease, even independent of other health factors. So I do think that there's something about experiencing structural racism that may have sort of an independent association with poor health outcomes, but I think it's still a new and emerging field, but I think it's a great question, Craig. And then to your second question about about colonialism and those kind of issues. Yeah, I do think that it's actually something that I've thought. I mean, this is more of just a thought response, and I don't know that I have data to back this up, but I do think that in the context of food insecurity, I mean, there are different types of colonialism, and I didn't go to that talk, but I think some people even argue that global health is some way colonialistic, or just by having sort of the medical industrial complex take over certain aspects. And I think that even in thinking about physicians, well, I mean, I think that, people like me who are interested in food insecurity and sort of these broader, or all of us are interested in broader social determinants of health. I think it's good to be aware of these things, but I think there's also a counter argument, or people who say that, physicians should not be dealing, physicians should stay within their medical knowledge and not be reaching their influence out into economic or social kind of issues, and that in some ways, by doing that, that is sort of colonialistic or whatever. I think that's probably not what you were trying to go for, but I do think that I've seen some of those arguments that, like, you know, that medicalizing some of these issues is, yeah, is also potentially a reach, but.
You know, that reminds me, and I think we could have this as a sort of later session. There's a lot of expertise among colleagues and collaborators on intersectional stigma. So how stigma related to HIV intersects with racism and gender discrimination and stigma related to poverty and stigma related to sex work and all of these other kinds of stigma and discrimination that people experience, and how those intersect to worsen HIV health. So I think we should come back to this in a later talk, but I want to make sure, Jason, we have time for your questions.
Thank you. So yeah, I thought that maybe we only have a few minutes left, but we could maybe just start off by talking a little bit about the Belachu articles. That's Belachu 2012, and this was looking at predictors of adolescent food insecurity in Ethiopia. So I guess either I wanted to see if people had thoughts about or could summarize what the authors found that in that study as significant predictors of adolescent food insecurity, and or just in your experience in Kenya, what other factors do you think may lead to food insecurity in adolescents in your experience?
Maybe you need to call on somebody.
Okay, maybe I can mention some of the predictors that I found from the reading. One of them was being female. I had a difficult time understanding why, but I'm sure now I'm going to learn why. And then there was high dependency ratio, whereby maybe you find adolescents, maybe because of even the time period, based on what we discussed earlier, of maybe going up to 24 years, you find that the adolescents or young adults tend to depend maybe on their parents much longer. So I think that's what it means. And then another predictor was simply household food insecurity, which would influence the food security situation of the adolescents. I read that there are issues to do with rationing the food and maybe stretching the food in food insecure households, which also tend to influence or maybe affect the adolescents. Then there was the education level as a predictor, whereby those with primary and below have more food insecurity than those who have a higher level of education. And I was just thinking about it and thinking, maybe could it be because in a household, if you can be able to attain a higher level of education, it should also follow that probably you satisfied the more basic need of food first. I was just thinking maybe that's the reason why households with higher levels of education, then their food insecurity is also lower. And I think another predictor was that, no, this one was not a predictor, but this is something I just wanted to ask. Why is it that household income in low-income urban households makes the low-income urban households suffer higher food insecurity than in rural areas, assuming the contemporaries, the adolescents, both in urban areas and in rural areas, where you have low-income urban housing or households, and where you have low-income rural households. Those in the urban settings tend to suffer more food insecurity than in the rural areas. I wanted to hear more about that. But yeah, that's what I managed to glean from that article. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was a great summary of some of the main findings. from that study. And I think, those findings were just based on their analysis of the data. So I think they had to then kind of hypothesize or guess as to why. And so, in terms of the most recent question about why there may be urban and rural differences observed, I'm not sure either, but one thing that I might imagine is that perhaps urban households are more dependent on income, whereas maybe rural households, if they're more subsistence or stuff like that, maybe people are producing their own crops or food, and so maybe it's not income. There are other factors that that may influence food insecurity, like as Sham Mahesh is studying and stuff like that. So it's possible that maybe in rural areas it's not income so much as it is just some of the resources available. But I don't know if other people have thoughts about that. And in terms of the gender differences, again, I don't know if they looked specifically at the mechanisms why, but I think we similarly found in the U.S. that food insecurity is higher in girls and women, and I think that it sort of reflects some of the gender gaps. Just like we've seen that girls have lower educational attainment or fewer years in school. It's also possible that some families may prioritize their son's food. So that's, I think, one. But I wonder if people have other thoughts about why there may be either those rural-urban differences or gender differences in food insecurity.
It looks like JJ has a comment. So,
Rhoda, looks like Rhoda.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Rhoda. I think you have a comment. I'm so sorry.
Yes, from the article, as I was reading through, it explained that those people who are in the low-income urban households, they are faced with the challenge of increased food prices.
I think we lost you, Rhoda, but I see your comment. I think you're going in and out, but I think Rhoda's comment was there's increased food prices in urban areas, unlike in rural areas where people can
who are in the rural areas not necessarily buy the food. So I think, okay.
Thank you, Rhoda, for that comment. So it is at the hour, but if Jason, if you're able to stay on a little bit longer for the last discussion question, we could go to that and people could stay on if they're available. And if not, we'll end. But if you and Philgona could stay on for a few more minutes, we could finish off the discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my other question was just if, other than the factors that they studied in that paper, if there were just other factors that you can think of, either in Kenya or in your experience or experience with adolescents that may also lead to food insecurity or other. And if not, any other questions for either me or Dr. Philgona about any of the content that we've talked about today?
I have a question concerning measurement. I know, so Dr. Philgona talked about the difficulties for parents to talk about the food insecurity of their children and making sometimes those measurements from parents not reliable. I wonder how reliable are the measurements from the children or their adolescents themselves? Because I saw in one of the papers that they were looking at measurements over 3 different time points, and it seemed like there was no consistency, and I wasn't sure whether that was actually referring to the actual situations in their households in those different time points, or it was also reflecting probably sort of like challenges in terms of how the children would perceive, you know, either their self-rated health, which was being measured also in that paper, or like food insecurity in general. So more of reliability of like the measurements from the children themselves.
Jason, were you going to take that one, or is that for Falgona?
I don't know, Falgona, did you have?
Actually, I wasn't able to hear. I don't know whether it's a problem from my end or from, I didn't get the question. Can you repeat for me or summarize?
Yeah, so Dr. Falgona, you mentioned the difficulties of parents reporting food insecurity in on behalf of their children. So sort of the shame and all of that that goes with it, that makes some of those measurements not as reliable. And I was wondering, in terms of measurements directly with the children or the adolescents themselves, how have you found that? Is it more reliable, or are there also challenges with that?
And along with that, Falgona, I wonder if you could talk about how you all opted to measure food security in the PEDS Shamba.
Yeah, thank you. So I basically there are still challenges even at the child level, because again it depends on the age of the child. Again, as you can imagine, depending on the age and the developmental stage of the child, it really depends on how they perceive what is around them and how they may respond to even the questions posed to them. But basically, it is better to talk to the children themselves, so they give you what their experience is. And as I had mentioned, that the best scenario here would be where you talk to the child, you talk also to the parents, so you put the two together, because all these are reported experiences and their perceptions. So put together, I think we are able to get better results. For PEDS, most of our reports were really married within the interviews, and we did not do a full food insecurity assessment, as it were. We have done the same in one of our studies, just picking that tool the way it is, and just administering, mainly getting the parental information. But we've not had an experience where we directly interview the children. And I think this is a new field where it's out there, and I think it should be tried and you know, in a research setting, so that we can see how we can validate such measurements. So I think it would be very interesting.
Great, thank you, Falgona. So just any final comments or questions before we close out?
What's next week? Or 2 weeks, sorry. What's next?
2 weeks, I'm going to give a sort of broader talk on food insecurity and HIV health. So focusing on how food insecurity affects HIV outcomes, mainly for adults, but including, it includes the young adults that Jason was referring to. So we'll go into pathways and mechanisms for how food insecurity is negatively affecting HIV health. And I will send around some readings later this week. So on that note, we just want to thank our excellent speakers today. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and thoughts. And we very much appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Any final comments, others? Craig or Anka, Louisa?
Just to thank Algona and Jason for excellent presentations and for our students for really good discussion.
Yes, thank you to all the presenters and for very thought-provoking discussions. We look forward to next week, and have a good evening and good morning to the US.
Thank you.
Good evening, good morning, and have a good rest of the day.
Yes, yes. And Philgona, lovely to see you. We'll have to catch up separately.
Yeah, definitely. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.